So I'd say we know there will be financial impact. Work has been focused on figuring out how we can estimate and measure this impact. We have some ideas on how to mitigate and what steps we might take, but the first step towards any kind of action is understanding the scope and the depth of the problem in the first place.
Hello, I'm Lindsay Aiken and I manage career services at the Department of Management Science and Engineering at Stanford University. Welcome to MS&E Stories and Voices, Graduating Student Profiles.
Quantifying and understanding. That's the key message from Brian Reed, a recent graduate from our PhD program, who's been researching the economic impacts of extreme weather. In recent years especially, we've all been seeing even more clearly the increasing evidence of climate change and global extreming. So I'm fascinated to hear more about Brian and his work. First off, huge thank you, Brian, for being here today. Please start us off with a little about you and your background.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. So I grew up in Connecticut and lived there my whole life up until college. In college, I went to Princeton and tried out a bunch of different things and wound up focusing on energy and the environment. From an applied math and econ perspective, I found energy markets and trading and policy to be this really interesting blend of economics and political science and actual physical science. And then I started looking more a little bit at climate at the end of my undergrad. Started a graduate program. It was more on the economic side. So the undergrad was a little bit more similar to MS&E, but it was more on the economic side, looking at climate change adaptation in Southeast Asia. And really getting an exposure to research and diving into research questions in a little bit more depth.
Yeah. And I remember from your profile that was at Yale that you did that?
Yeah. It was then the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and now I think it's the School of the Environment.
Okay. And so, yeah, with Princeton and Yale, kind of a further study beyond that, I'm sure you had your pick of places. So what drew you here to Stanford and to MS&E?
Yeah, so I think in the master's program, I found that I really liked diving into research and doing the deep dives and really getting my hands dirty in a given topic. So the PhD was a pretty natural next step. Coming out to Stanford let me take a more computational and statistical direction. John Wyatt, my advisor, sits at the hub of a couple of different disciplines. So he's encouraged me to explore more of the natural science side and more of the econ side and more of the computer science side as well. And I think Stanford more generally has a pretty unique blend, not only of the experts, but of encouragement to engage with different experts. The department itself is pretty well positioned between those different disciplines. So it was easy to have a conversation with somebody in economics and take econ classes and take the core MS&E classes and then sit on some Earth system science classes and then try out some computer science stuff and sort of blend the different methods and different tools from the different departments to focus on the problems and the issues that were interesting.
Yeah. Sounds like such a broad overview that you've done to then kind of have that breadth and then also focus in and have the depth, that specific focus of your research. So what would you say is the foundational problem that your research has been looking at and aiming to solve?
It's evolved a little bit over the course of the PhD, but the broad arcs of it have been, how do we go from the climate we have today to the climate we'll see in 2100? So we know the climate is changing, but what do things look like along the way? Because the climate isn't static. So we've shown in general that climate and weather seem to matter. And I've been trying to help build out the field of research that looks at how much they matter and how much it matters if a specific company is affected, and then how much it matters if the supplier of a company is affected as well. And it looks like the impacts are on the same order of magnitude, a little bit smaller, but on the same order of magnitude if your supplier is impacted as if you're impacted. So we're just sort of starting to get a sense of the implications of that and what it means for firm level climate risk, which is what I've more focused on, and then more generally the economic risk across different sectors.
So, like, what is the actual dollar amount or percentage amount of level of profit they might expect to be able to make?
Yeah, so I looked at a measure of profitability, which is pretty specific measure of how efficiently a firm uses resources and how efficiently it uses its assets to turn a profit. And then I could say the impact of an initial day of extreme heat is roughly 0.6%, and extreme rain is 1.8%. And then we can slice it by different sectors and different seasons and get a little bit finer picture of where the impacts are going to come into play.
And how it's going to hit all of these different companies. You've talked before about how agriculture is one of these industry areas that obviously receives a lot of focus. It's very easy to understand kind of the impact on crops and foods. A lot of us grow gardens and we see that ourselves, but what other industries and areas are likely to be significantly impacted, already being significantly impacted by what we're seeing climate-wise?
Yeah, so the industries that I found were a little bit different for heat and for rainfall. So for heat, I found that firms that produce material goods, firms that are involved in heavier industrial processes, firms that are in healthcare, but in healthcare manufacturing, are all statistically significantly impacted by extreme heat. And for precipitation, it tends to be more energy firms and then industrial firms as well, those heavy industrial firms. The energy firms are the more extractive industries. So you can think of mines or wells being flooded. And I think it's interesting because we think of agriculture when we think of these impacts, and we also just think of people being outside or people experiencing health impacts. And I think it's been a little bit understudied, the other channels and the other industries that can be impacted by these same types of events.
So broad ranging, how much this change is impacting the whole world. And this is just such fascinating work that you've been doing. What are you hoping that some of the outcomes are then, the impact that your research can have on these different industries?
Yeah, so I think overarching, I would hope that it helps to inform some of the policy discussion from climate change. So we have measures like the economic cost or the social cost of carbon that uses a lot of this type of research and uses estimates of the damages from climate and weather on different sectors of the economy. And this in the past has primarily taken into account the agricultural impacts and the mortality impacts. Hopefully it'll broaden the scope a little bit about what kinds of things we're looking at and what types of things we're considering. I think that's sort of a longer term goal or hope, because as I said, it's more that I looked at the company level climate risk than the broader economic climate risk. And you can see the connection between the two, but being careful about how one turns into the other is going to be pretty important when we think about mechanisms and how these things happen. I think on the firm level side, there's been increased interest and concern from companies about how they're impacted. And I think from what I can tell so far, a lot of the concern or the work on this focuses on exposure to weather and exposure to heat and exposure to rainfall and exposure to different types of storms. And it has focused a little bit less on translating that into financial outcomes or performance. Hopefully this work will help give a sense of how we can translate some of the exposure metrics and the changing exposure into dollars and decisions.
So it's like companies have the sense that this is happening, but they don't have the sense yet of what it's going to cost them?
Yeah, I think the role of academic research in this is to sort of give a sense of not only what the values are and what the damages are, but how we can think about these things and how we can measure them. And the SEC and federal regulators have also been interested, because there's a question of how we can inform investors and how we can make sure that people have the information that they need to make sound financial decisions, not only within the companies, but other people who have a stake in the company. So there's been discussions about requiring companies to disclose their risk, not only like how much carbon they're emitting, but how exposed they are to these extreme events. And we don't really have a great sense or a well-developed methodology for determining that exposure so far.
So it seems there's a lot we do know, about the risks and costs, and your work is contributing a lot into that. But there's still a lot that we don't know. Can you kind of sum up where we stand?
Yeah, so I'd say we know there will be financial impact. Work has been focused on figuring out how we can estimate and measure this impact. We have some ideas on how to mitigate and what steps we might take, but the first step towards any kind of action is understanding the scope and the depth of the problem in the first place. So ideally, this type of work, saying the impacts on specific industries and specific seasons, can help us then focus our efforts in the next phase of taking whatever hedging strategies we might think of in order to start reducing some of these impacts.
So it's understanding exactly what the risk is to then have an appropriate level of response.
Yeah, and the risk in terms of how bad, and then the dollar value of that as well.
Let's pivot this to sort of some more questions about the space and where you think your type of work is going to have the most impact, with all of these questions remaining about what's the best ways to mitigate, what exactly should we do, what's going to be the most cost effective, what are the next steps, future research that other people can do in this field?
Yeah, I think there are still definitely open questions on risk and exposure, whether it's in terms of weather or dollars or whatever metric. But my hope is that we can start to do a little bit more experimentation on which adaptation measures we can take in order to reduce those impacts. At some point, the type of work that I was doing in my dissertation will become a little bit more commonplace and a little bit more standard, and we'll know mitigation and how we can reduce our emissions of carbon. And we absolutely need to do that as quickly as possible and as dramatically as possible, ideally without incurring additional costs or taking into account different disadvantaged communities. But we also need to recognize that some of these changes are baked in. So even as we're mitigating and reducing our carbon, we can take certain steps so that the changes that are already baked in terms of increasing temperatures and more variable rainfall have a little bit less of a disruption to society, and in this case to companies, but that has impacts on consumers and everyday people as well.
It sounds like a little more on being able to quantify in dollar amounts the benefits of doing some of these mitigation efforts.
Doing some of the adaptation efforts. Yes. Yeah. Moving a little bit from understanding and quantifying to action and specific steps.
So as we talk about these risk implications then for companies, what are some of the things that, if you were CEO of some of these particular companies, what are the things that you would be putting to the top of the priority list from that company point of view?
Yeah, I think there's always a tendency to look at things with sort of rose-colored glasses and be optimistic. I think in the case of climate and extreme weather, it's helpful to plan for some of the extremes and some of the edge cases. And I think some of those extremes and edge cases are ones that are not likely to happen, but if they do happen, it's going to be really disruptive. So one thing that I didn't quite get the time to look at in my dissertation, but would be interesting, is looking at an overlay of particularly important production facilities or shipping facilities and extreme weather, and start to identify not just the impacts in general of these extremes, but the impacts of specifically critical choke points on the rest of production. And I think ideally we'll be able to move to a place where we can say, well, what if there is extreme heat and we lose power in one facility? To what extent does this disrupt our operations? And I think the correlations and the weather risk and the fringe cases that probably won't happen, hopefully won't happen, but might happen. I think in the last couple of years, we've been seeing that these things are starting to happen a little bit more, and just proactively planning and having some sense of what we might do is a good first step.
Understanding what these risks and the impacts are and could well be, and then starting to plan for how to work around that, mitigate it. Something else you've talked about before too is that for some companies that have risk, other company will have an opportunity with that. Is that something, could you talk a little bit more about that too, and some examples of where some companies could maybe even get a competitive advantage from this?
This is something that comes up really tangibly when we're thinking about where companies are located. So if you're a manufacturing company and you base one of your major factories in a traditional hurricane path, then it's more likely that you would be taken offline even for a couple of hours or a couple of days if you're impacted by a storm. And then a direct competitor of yours who is not affected by that storm would be, for however long you're offline, in a better position to compete. So the disruptions, we can think of your production and your profit. There's a potential competitive advantage if you better hedge this risk. Like if you, then that's just another step towards making your company a little bit more resilient and robust, and hopefully better positioning yourself relative to competitors.
Such a lot to think about for people. Thinking for all of us as individuals, we're all consumers, a lot of us heads of households, and from this economic point of view, so we're all trying to stretch our dollars. How can we take advantage, at an individual level of what your research is able to teach us?
There is, hopefully we can think a little bit more about those extremes and those edge cases and how they impact our own lives. I know here in California, even in the last couple of years, it feels like we've seen more days in the 90s or above 100. Our homes and offices haven't historically been built to withstand those types of heat. So I think, especially with some of the bigger purchases you make in life, like with homes or air conditioning or home heating systems, at some point the timelines for those decisions and the timelines where we say we'll be using this for the next 5 years or 10 years, or we'll be living here for the next 20 years or 30 years, those are going to start to be the same time horizons where we'll start to see hotter days or wetter days or more floods. So it's good to keep in mind that some of these things might be changing and might not just affect companies or farmers, but could impact the neighborhoods we live in. And a lot of this sort of information historically has been in insurance companies or some government agencies somewhere. We don't necessarily need to track climate forecasts as closely or as daily as we track weather forecasts, but just having a little bit more exposure and more of a sense of how things are going to change in our particular neighborhoods or where we're thinking of living or where our family members live, I think can help us make especially those larger purchases in life a little bit more sensibly.
Yeah, definitely worth making that investment into a home air conditioning system or planting some more trees around our homes.
Yeah. Hopefully we don't all need to install AC, but we'll see.
Yeah, that has knock-on impacts as well. So thank you so much, Brian, for being here and covering all of this today. I want to finish with just the last few fun questions that I ask of everyone. First one is your advice for people coming into the program that you're finishing up, so in your case, the PhD program, that maybe somebody else hasn't already told them.
Yeah, I think I would say just to reach out to as many people as you can whose work you find interesting, just to try to get a better sense of what they're working on, how they can be working on it, how you might be able to lend a hand if you're interested. Especially in the first couple of years of a PhD program, I think faculty members and later year PhD students are especially willing to share and give knowledge, help students find the things that really make them tick. And I think both gaining that exposure and then gaining some experience in actually working on what they're working on, even if it's for a few months or a quarter or a year, I think, especially in the first couple of years, the course load can be pretty heavy, just so that you can gain expertise and comfort in specific tools. But it's always good to get a sense of what you might want to work on and where you're heading and how other people in the spaces think about the types of problems you're interested in.
And then what would you say your life maxim is? That signature phrase that people are rolling their eyes at, future grandkids are going to like, oh, granddad, but they also know that you're going to be right.
Yeah, it's a little simple, but I would say just give it a shot. And if you're interested in something or you're curious about something, even if you're a little bit nervous, just try it and see how it goes. And maybe it'll go well, maybe it won't go well, maybe you'll love it, maybe you won't love it, but you won't really know until you give it a shot.
Give it a shot. It's a good one to live by for sure. And then finally, 2 books and a podcast. So a book that's MS&E related, MS&E adjacent, that you feel like is a good one for everybody to read, and then another one that's just for fun, and then your favorite podcast as well.
Yeah, so the more MS&E one for me would be Social and Economic Networks. It's by a professor in the econ department here. It's by Matt Jackson, who has written a range of books, some a little bit more informative and technical, and some a little bit more targeted for a popular audience as well. But this book was sort of just a foundational look at how people and places and firms interact with each other. And we kind of know that relationships are important and that it matters who we're friends with or who we work with or who we work under. This book, Social and Economic Networks, just gives a little bit more formality to how we can think about those relationships. And more on the fun side, I guess this is a little bit of a cheat, but I would say just the Lord of the Rings books in general. The trilogy mainly, I think I sort of love just getting lost in the world that Tolkien created and the sense of awe and camaraderie and all those things. The movies are great too, obviously. And the podcast, since coming out to California, I've been listening to the California Report with some regularity. It's by KQED, it's NPR's local arm. And I think it just helped give me a little bit better sense of what's going on in the state. I think especially having grown up elsewhere, I don't have the same sense of history or context of what's going on in the Bay Area and California, and it's been a nice little window.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of MS&E Stories and Voices, Graduating Student Profiles. This episode was produced and edited by me, Lindsay Aiken, with editing help from Jim Fabry. Our music was composed and performed by Catherine Barron, another student in our master's program. Please be sure to subscribe to us on Spotify or whichever platform you're listening through. And check out our website at msne.stanford.edu. It's msande.stanford.edu. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.